been here now 10 years.
Okay. And where did you work
journey.
before you came to Sovereign Hill?
Prior to this position was the Phillip Island Nature Park. So I was the Director of Marketing there. So I was there for 6 years. So done the 2 big attractions in the state.
Right.
So my time at Phillip Island being a nature-based wildlife destination, when I was there, international visitation was 60% of their market. And that was just the characteristics of the destination. Now at Sovereign Hill, which sits in the history heritage category for tourism, we get around 30% international. So there's a big difference. I think globally, wildlife, nature-based is one of the top drivers of tourism. So history and heritage, I say, is second tier, and probably a little bit more difficult in terms of marketing to internationals in the Australian content. As we know, when we go to holidays to Europe and America, what do? We go to museums and cultural attractions. But when visitors come to Australia, I think the first tick is the wildlife and the things like the iconic things like the 12 apostles. Now for Sovereign Hill, it's a little bit different. Our interest being gold is one of the core elements of our brand in a marketing sense, is very much of interest to the Asian community. So the biggest growth for us has been out of countries like China, Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. They've got that interest in gold, but particularly China, with our amazing history of the Chinese coming here during the gold rush. There's a strong connection there between the two countries.
Sorry?
The drivers have gone off to check into the hotel.
Oh, right. So it's a Malaysian tour group.
These groups from Malaysia.
Yeah, the Chinese government opened up tourism outbound many years ago, 15 or so years ago. Australia was one of the first destinations of approved status, as they call it. So we're the first Western country to get Chinese consumer visitors to travel to Australia, and
So
we benefit greatly from that.
You're saying beforehand they weren't allowed to come and visit countries, but then the Chinese government changed the law, and it's called the approved
destination. The approved destination status.
Yeah.
So Australia was one of the very first back in 1998. So that was incredible for us as a country, because it's now one of the biggest markets globally outbound.
Australia now has an agreement with China as in a trade agreement, don't we? And how's that going to affect it?
I think that's a positive thing. I think for the travel industry, I think there will be some pickup of demand, but we were at the forefront of that many years ago. I think in broader, it'll just open up boundaries for the two countries.
What do you reckon, has been like probably the most major change in tourism in the last 20 years or so?
Look, I think there's been a few things. I think one of the big impacts internationally has been air access. And the big one there is the low-cost airlines. But certainly for Australia being a long-haul destination, I think the lowering cost of airfares has been the biggest impact that I've seen in the markets, and the internet, of course. The opening up of people, ease of access into product and making their own bookings, both on a desktop and on a handheld device.
So that communication technology, the internet, has that led to a lot more independent travellers?
Oh, for sure. I think as the world opened up 30 years ago, the group market was predominant back then because they were unsure of destinations they were going to. And most people went to a travel agent to make their travel bookings. But nowadays people do a lot more research, that the countries they're travelling to, that there's a lot more knowledge of destinations.
You've also talked recently about India. Why are you looking at India as sort of the next pool of people coming?
Again, it's the population growth, it's economic, in terms of economic, they're a powerhouse like China. So across the globe, India is probably the next big market, whilst it's a low base, low numbers at the moment, but double-digit growth for us.
I'm interested, to characterise, if you like, the Chinese tourists and maybe the Indians a little bit. Are they all in bus groups, or are they coming by themselves? There's a movement for people these days to be independent travellers and to use the internet to actually book everything that they want. Is that what's happening with the Chinese market, or are they more coming in organised groups?
Bit of both now. Back 15 years ago, there were predominant groups. It was, outbound tourism was new to them. So it was the traditional sort of 8 to 10 day itinerary for Australia. So they would go to Sydney, up in the Gold Coast, and then come down to Melbourne. So short holiday, and predominantly groups. But as the market's developing, you've now got the younger generation that don't want to follow their parents' footsteps and visit all the icons and go as a group. They want to be independent and see the world themselves. So the independent travel market is the biggest growth market out of those areas, and same with India. But the China market is an interesting one. It's about 50-50 now, 50% groups and 50% FIT, so that means fully independent traveller. The sharing community has been developed probably over 6 or so years now. Airbnb, which is one of the first ones where people can stay in a person's home. So it's been a global business that's just grown immensely over the last 5 years. So but now you've got the power of the knowledge. So with TripAdvisor in travel, you've got the power of knowledge of where you're going. So people, when they're wanting to do a day trip or overnight trip to Sovereign Hill in Ballarat, they would research, and they would have such great knowledge of all the, staying overnight. They would know we have accommodation here. They would know the facilities. They would know the price, and they would look at the reviews on TripAdvisor, see if the reviews are good or bad, staying at our accommodation. So it's quite a powerful change for the consumer. Difficult for the marketer.
I'm going to say, it would have changed your job. You'd have to spend a lot more time looking at the web presence, but also what people are saying on those social media platforms. Very
much so. There's a diagram, a marketing diagram of back in the 70s and 80s of how to market to now, and nowadays it is so complex for a marketing, and so many more channels you've got to deal with. So my job is becoming a lot more complex, and probably a lot more academic in terms of data mining and things like that, and reviewing a lot more research and the consumer journey, or the purchasing journey.